History does not move in a straight line. It is defined by moments of violent, systemic shock, where the established order is not merely challenged, but entirely shattered. The greatest of these transformations are often not the product of human design, of revolutions or grand policies, but of an indifferent biological catalyst. For centuries, the economic system of Europe was a machine designed for permanence, a rigid structure locking 90% of the population into a predetermined fate. But it was about to collide with a microscopic organism that would rewrite humanity's economic trajectory. Now, let's open the historical ledger and analyze the economic blueprint this crisis left behind. To understand the sheer scale of the reset that followed the Black Death, we must first deconstruct the system it broke. The economy of the early 14th century was not a market of willing buyers and sellers as we might recognize it today. A landowner, faced with the choice of illegally paying a higher wage to get his crops harvested or obeying the law and watching them rot in the field, would choose to break the law every time. The records are filled with prosecutions under the statute, which proves not that it worked, but that it was being systematically ignored on a massive scale. The velocity of economic change was too great for the static legal system to contain. This failure is the ultimate data point proving the thesis. The shock to the labor supply was so profound that it overwhelmed the political and social structures designed to contain it. The peasantry, for their part, were not passive. They were now mobile, increasingly aware of their own value. They voted with their feet, abandoning manners that tried to enforce the old obligations and migrating to those offering freedom and cash. This newfound mobility was the final nail in the coffin of traditional serfdom, a structural change that would permanently alter the trajectory of Western economies. The recalibration was not just in prices and wages, it was a fundamental rewiring of the relationship between the individual and the economic system. The consequences of this economic recalibration unfolded over the subsequent century, proving to be not a temporary disruption, but a permanent structural transformation. The old feudal equilibrium was not restored, it was replaced. The institution of serfdom, already weakened, entered a terminal decline in Western Europe. As landowners were forced to compete for labor, they had to offer more attractive terms. The old feudal dues and labor obligations were gradually commuted to cash rents. This seemingly small administrative change had a profound consequence. It turned the serf into a tenant. It transformed an obligatory relationship into a contractual one. This was the birth of a recognizable, modern, wage-based economy. Out of the ashes of this old system, a new social and economic class began to emerge. With soaring wages for their labor and falling costs for land, the most successful peasants were able to accumulate a small amount of capital. For the first time, they had disposable income. They could lease more land, improve it, and sell their surplus produce in a true market. This was the genesis of the yeoman farmer in England, a prosperous, independent class that stood between the peasantry and the landed gentry. This proto-middle class had a different consumption pattern. Their demand for better clothing, household goods, and tools stimulated local manufacturing and trade in a way the subsistence economy never could. Furthermore, the persistent high cost of labor created a powerful systemic incentive for innovation. Landowners and burgeoning industries now had a direct financial reason to invest in any technology that could save labor, from more efficient plows to early mechanical devices, planting the seeds of a technological trajectory that would blossom centuries later. This brings us to the modern parallel, the enduring lesson of this historical system shock. The 14th century crisis serves as the ultimate historical laboratory for understanding the fundamental and often brutal relationship between labor, capital, and crisis. Today we talk of labor shortages, of the Great Resignation, of shifting leverage between employees and employers in a post-pandemic world. We debate the impact of automation on the value of human work. The Black Death provides a stark, data-driven framework for analyzing these very dynamics. It demonstrates that the balance of power between labor and capital is not a constant. It can be radically altered by external shocks that reset the core supply and demand equation. The failed statute of laborers is a timeless lesson for policymakers that economic fundamentals are a far more powerful force than political decrees. When the underlying value of labor changes, the system will eventually have to change with it, regardless of the laws designed to prevent it. The story of the Black Death's economic aftermath is therefore not one of death, but of an accidental, violent, and painful rebirth. It reveals that the rigid structures we build can be shattered by forces we cannot see, and that within these crises lie the catalysts for immense, unforeseen change. By analyzing the data and deconstructing the mechanisms of this historical reset, we gain a more sophisticated framework for interpreting the economic shifts of our own time. It allows us to see the patterns, to understand the leverage, and to recognize that the economic world we inhabit is not fixed, but is in a constant state of recalibration. It was a static, hierarchical framework known as manorialism, the economic engine of the broader feudal system. This was a world defined by obligation, not opportunity. The central unit of production was the manor, a self-sufficient estate controlled by a lord. The labor force was comprised of peasants, the vast majority of whom were serfs. It is critical to understand the serf not as an employee, but as an economic asset tied to the land itself. They were not slaves, but their mobility was non-existent. They owed labor, a share of their crops, and various fees to their lord, not in exchange for a wage, but for the right to cultivate a small plot of land for their own subsistence and for a measure of protection. This created a state of permanent economic equilibrium, but it was an equilibrium of immense friction and structural inequality. The value of the two primary factors of production, labor and capital, was catastrophically imbalanced. Capital, in this era, was land. It was finite, controlled by a tiny aristocratic and clerical elite, and it was the sole source of wealth and power. Labor, on the other hand, was abundant to the point of being functionally worthless. Generations of population growth had created a surplus of hands to work the fields. This demographic pressure, what economists would later term a Malthusian state, gave landowners immense leverage. If a peasant complained or underperformed, there were countless others ready to take their place. There was no incentive to innovate, no mechanism for wage negotiation, and no pathway for social or economic advancement. The system was designed to keep the peasantry in a state of perpetual subsistence, producing just enough to feed themselves and generate a surplus for the lord. Wealth did not flow, it was extracted and held. Then, in 1347, this tightly wound system was exposed to a black swan event of unimaginable magnitude. A Genoese trading ship, fleeing a siege in the Crimean port of Caffa, docked in Messina, Sicily. Aboard its decks were not just merchants and sailors, but rats, and on those rats, fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Within months, the great pestilence had begun its relentless march across the continent. We can visualize this on a map. From the ports of Italy, it followed the trade routes, the arteries of the medieval world, spreading into France, Spain, England, and Germany. Its transmission was terrifyingly efficient, and its mortality rate was unprecedented. Within 5 years, from 1347 to 1351, it is estimated that the Black Death erased between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population. In some urban centers, the toll may have reached 60% or higher. The immediate economic consequence was not a recession. It was a complete systemic breakdown. This was not a cyclical downturn. It was a sudden, catastrophic deletion of the primary input of the entire economic model: human labor. Fields went untilled, not for a season, but permanently, as entire villages were wiped from the map. Livestock wandered untended, becoming feral. The skilled labor of craftsmen in the towns, weavers, blacksmiths, masons, vanished. The fundamental pillar of the manorial system, the lord's absolute power derived from a surplus of disposable labor, crumbled. For the first time in centuries, the core assumption of the European economy was inverted. Labor was no longer abundant and cheap. It was suddenly, terrifyingly scarce. The equilibrium had been broken, and the primary mechanism of wealth extraction was failing. The survivors, both lord and peasant, found themselves in a new world, one whose economic rules were not yet written. The immediate aftermath of the Black Death was not a period of reconstruction, but of pure economic chaos. The old system had been built on a structural asymmetry of power, and with the demographic foundation gone, that structure inverted with breathtaking speed. This was the great recalibration. To deconstruct this mechanism, we must view the plague not as a tragedy, but as a violent, uncontrolled economic experiment in labor scarcity. The fundamental law of supply and demand, previously suppressed by the rigid feudal framework, now asserted itself with relentless force. With the labor supply cut in half, the surviving peasantry, the serfs, the cottagers, the landless workers, were suddenly in possession of the single most valuable commodity in Europe, their own time and energy. For the first time in centuries, they had leverage. Lords of manors, who for generations had commanded a surplus of near-free labor, were now faced with a catastrophic operational crisis. Their private lands, the domain, which produced the crops for their own profit, lay fallow. To bring in a harvest required workers, and the handful of survivors in any given village were no longer a captive workforce. We see in the historical records, such as the court rolls of English manors, a dramatic shift in behavior. Peasants began refusing the traditional labor services they owed. Why work for the lord for free when the neighboring manor was desperately offering cash? This introduces a critical concept into the mainstream economy: the wage. While wage labor existed before the plague, it was peripheral. Now, it became the central point of negotiation. Peasants began demanding and receiving hard currency for their work. This is where the data provides us with a clear, quantitative picture of the revolution underway. If we track the trajectory of real wages, that is, wages adjusted for the cost of living, the catalyst becomes undeniable. Economic historians who have analyzed medieval account books have shown that for an unskilled English laborer, real wages rose by at least 50% in the decade following the plague. For skilled workers, like carpenters and masons, who were now in exceptionally high demand for repairs and new construction, wages more than doubled. A master carpenter who might have earned 3 pence a day in 1347 could command 6 or 7 pence by 1355. Simultaneously, the value of capital, land, plummeted. With so much land left vacant and so few people to farm it, rents collapsed. A lord could no longer dictate terms. He had to entice tenants with lower rents, longer leases, and fewer traditional obligations. The economic asymmetry had flipped. The value of labor soared, while the value of the capital it worked with fell. Now, it is a common misconception to assume the ruling classes simply accepted this new reality. They did not. Their response was an attempt to use political and legal power to reverse an economic tide. This is a critical case study in policy failure. In England, the panicked aristocracy passed the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This legislation was a desperate attempt to nail the economy back to its 1346 framework. It made it illegal for employers to offer, or for workers to accept, wages higher than the pre-plague standard. It mandated that every able-bodied person under 60 must work. And most critically, it sought to restrict the movement of labor, forbidding peasants from leaving their home manor in search of a better offer. On paper, it was a draconian assertion of the old order. In practice, it was an abject failure. The law was simply unenforceable because it ran contrary to the fundamental economic self-interest of every single participant in the market, including the lords themselves.